Podcast Two. This is the research talk from the Ukrainian Studies Foundation in Australia and the State Library of Victoria Fellowship about the Two Twigs. And I'm Dr. Natalie Senjov-Makohon, a scholar and fellow at the State Library of Victoria. Welcome to the second podcast to give a digital footprint to the first Ukrainian Geelong immigrants in Australia. In this podcast, I will talk about the disruptions and displacements that our Ukrainian Geelong immigrants experienced prior to arriving in Geelong, Australia. Disruptions. You will remember that these first Ukrainian Geelong immigrants arrived in Australia after World War II, and in their lives they experienced many social, economic and political disruptions. There have been many social, economic and political disruptions in the lives of the peoples who live in the lands of Ukraine today. The disruptions demanded social, political, economic and other changes in the respective societies of various empires. The empires of Habsburg, Russia and Germany created different conditions for the local Ukrainian populations. And these conditions were not necessarily congenial and beneficial for the inhabitants. Generally, the inhabitants were expected to blend into the various empires, and they were not given autonomy over their land or lives. Their economy remained retarded as they tilled the soil of their masters from dawn to dusk. The empires ruled from a distance and were custodians, although in their constitutions equal rights were mentioned for the individual peoples. These people were never in control of their own destiny and often suffered great human losses as the various empires transgressed these lands. On the eve of World War I, many young men were mobilised into the various armies to support the war efforts of the empires. In 1914, at the initiative of the Supreme Ukrainian Council in Galicia, volunteers after a short training period were mobilised to fight on the Russian front. In Bosnia, many young Ukrainian men were mobilised into the Ukrainian unit in the Austrian army. These men did not become involved in the multi-civil war in Yugoslavia between the partisans of the Serbian royalist Chetniks, Croatian nationalist Ustashi and the Home Guard troops. Instead, they volunteered to fight for a free Ukraine. On the 1st of November 1918, Russia occupied Lviv. However, ongoing hostility proved detrimental to the realisation of an ongoing independent Ukraine. The Ukrainian young men returned home to Bosnia, losing some of their comrades in battle, only to find a new political and social structure. The new political and social structure was the formation of a new kingdom, consisting of Serbs, Croats and Slovenians in 1918, and later renamed Yugoslavia by King Alexander III in 1928. This structure caused political strain, which was further aggravated by economic and social tensions. Ukrainians suffered and many lost their possessions and had to rebuild their lives with a few resources. Educational and cultural life deteriorated, and in some communities social and cultural activities ceased or became dormant. Ties with Ukraine were severed as boundaries were redrawn on the world map. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian population in Bosnia continued to preserve their culture and language, congregating around the Catholic Church for religious instructions in Ukrainian. Reading rooms opened at the larger centres of Ukrainian communities, and the youth socialised at church festivals, weddings and dances, where the local orchestra and choir entertained the attendees. Until the Second World War, Ukrainians remained in the villages where they settled prior to the First World War, working the land, making a living as skilled tradespersons in the local area. After the Second World War, as the young people began to migrate to cities, many of the older generation were unable to further work the land in Bosnia. And soon entire families migrated to Bachka, Voivodina and Slavonia, buying land and re-establishing themselves. Let's look at what type of displacements the Second World War brought to our Geelong Ukrainians. World War II and displacement. The Second World War broke out, and once again the young Ukrainian men in the lands of Yugoslavia joined the legionaries to fight for a free Ukraine. They knew that in the years 1939 to 1945, the former Galicia belonged to the portion of Europe which suffered greater human losses than anywhere in previous European history. They knew as the Second World War began to manifest itself, Ukrainians had little to lose from the sweeping changes across Europe, since they had been traumatised by Stalinist excesses and Polish, Romanian and Hungarian repressions. The collapse of Poland brought many repressions from the Soviet regime, and the German invasion brought a Nazi regime. Ukraine was caught between Nazi and Soviet regimes. By 1944, Ukraine and its inhabitants were subject to the worst terrors of the war, as each side invaded and regressed from the territory of Ukraine. For Ukrainians, the war posed the problem of how to make the best of what was essentially a no-win situation to preserve one's life. This self-preservation continued into the labour camps and farms of Germany. During and after the Second World War, many refugees found themselves in Germany, Austria and Italy. Most of them were labour conscripts, war prisoners, concentration camp prisoners, victims of war and refugees. These people were stateless and often fleeing the advancement of Soviet troops and communism. After the Second World War, millions of Europeans were evacuated, expelled or resettled, or they immigrated. They became refugees and displaced persons trekking through the rubbles and ruins of post-Second World War. Displaced persons are coerced out of their home and evacuated, resettled, transferred or migrated into another part of the world. The term displaced person was initially applied to citizens of the German-occupied countries. After 1945, 1946, when most of them had returned to their homelands, it was applied only to those refugees who refused to return to their countries, particularly those that were communist dominant. Where did these people find themselves? Camps. Ukrainians found themselves in camps in Germany, Austria and Italy as displaced persons. Added to the forced immigration and displacement was Hitler's deportation policy of civilian population, especially in Eastern Europe. Many Ukrainians were deported to Germany, firstly in concentration camps, and then employed as agricultural, industrial and other public workers. Another source of displaced persons was the undesirables or political prisoners who resisted the Nazi regime. The displaced person or DPs numbers grew as more came out of hiding from the Soviet Union. Towards the end of World War II, the number of DPs or displaced persons increased as many people were fleeing the advancement of the Red Army. The Western Allies foresaw but underestimated the numbers of displaced persons. The concept of DPs determined the shape of the Allied, that is, English, American, French and USSR's republics' humanitarian effort after the war, which created a refugee crisis. In Germany and Austria, most refugees were in the camps for less than 5 years. The living conditions were inadequate. Nevertheless, the social, cultural and political activities developed a sense of identity. Young people were socialised into a camp culture, combining Ukrainian cultural values and norms with a temporary, makeshift daily and institutional life, which was sustained after resettlement. The cultural life in these camps ensured the continuation of the transmission of Ukrainian values, language and attitudes. The young Ukrainians joined SUM, Ukrainian Youth Association, and children attended Ukrainian school. Choirs and cultural activities were encouraged. Meanwhile, the migration from Yugoslavia occurred with the Soviet-Yugoslav dispute, that is, the Stalin-Tito dispute of 1948 over national independence as one of the issues. In 1950, the economic crisis of Yugoslavia and the peasant opposition to collectivisation of land by Yugoslavs, including Ukrainians, who owned their land from the beginning of their migration into Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia in the 1890s and 1910s, brought resistance. Ukrainians, similar to other minorities, were encouraged to repatriate or resettle abroad. Once again, Ukrainians became mobile, except this time they immigrated to Trieste, Italy in 1950 and established themselves in a community to preserve their cultural heritage and identity. The Trieste camp was the hub for refugees and was charged by international organisations with the care and the maintenance of refugees. The Trieste camp became the hub of cultural activities and the development of cultural traditions, heritage, and the transmission of Ukrainian identity. Plus, Ukrainian Scouting Organisation played a pivotal role in the transmission of Ukrainian identity. Besides the scouting activities, the youth was taught Ukrainian and all traditional heritage, for example, dancing and singing in youth choirs. Just as the Metropolitan of Halych, Metropolis Sheptetsky, was aware of the plight of Ukrainians in the late 1890s and early 1900s, Archbishop Buchko of Western Europe visited the Ukrainian congregation in Trieste on the 13th of September 1953. This congregation gathered around the church as they had done previously in Bosnia, Bachka and other parts of the former Yugoslavia. Again, as previously, the Ukrainian Catholic Church played a significant role in the cultural identity of these displaced persons. International organisations, UNRWA and Arthur A. Caldwell. A number of organisations were pivotal in assisting displaced persons. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, was established in 1943 to plan, coordinate, administer or arrange for the administration of measures for the relief of victims of war in any area under the control of the United Nations. UNRWA was established to assist refugees, and initially its central responsibility was health, to combat epidemics and manage international sanitary resolutions. UNRWA was to rebuild and improve health services. However, some other services developed, including teaching the displaced persons new trades. These new trades proved an advantage as Australia opened her doors to the Two Twigs. These new trades proved an advantage as Australia opened her doors to the Two Twigs. Arthur A. Caldwell. An important landmark occurred in Australia, and Arthur A. Caldwell, the first Minister for Immigration in 1945, set the tone to ensure increases in population, national output, labour contribution and productive capacity. The tone enabled people to invest in themselves so that they could benefit personally and simultaneously contribute to Australia. In 1947, a new immigration department was established to control the process of immigration, to control the process of becoming Australian citizens and the reception of migrants into Australia and their assimilation into the Australian way of life. As Caldwell reflected, the migrants had to accept employment for 2 years in a place decided upon the immigration department. He thought it was fair. because the Australian government provided accommodation all around Australia. He further stated that after 2 years, 80% remained with the same employers. They bought their own houses, established their own families, and brought their relatives to Australia to live with them. By the end of 1947, the immigration policy was displaying encouraging outcomes. This optimism was echoed by Corwell in Parliament when he coined the term New Australians for migrants instead of DPs or displaced persons by the end of 1947. Corwell encouraged new Australian festivals to introduce their culture to the Australian community, as well as foreign language newspapers. He realised the new Australians were becoming a substantial group who began to contribute to the economic and industrial expansion of Australia. He emphasised the importance of economic development and security, the expansion of Australian population, and the importance of welcoming new Australians and achieving the policy of full employment. With this emphasis, displacement became a unique contributing factor. From displacement to uniqueness. Displacements. The Ukrainian Geelong immigration began in the late 1940s and early 1950s, mainly from the European continent. Australia welcomed large groups mostly from Eastern Europe, including Ukraine and Yugoslavia. The Ukrainians from Ukraine overwhelmingly were fleeing persecution in the Soviet Union, and the Ukrainians from Yugoslavia were searching for a better economic life as Tito opened the borders of Yugoslavia. This combination created a vibrant and complex community which survived in Geelong for 70 years and hopefully will continue for many years to come. From the European viewpoint, and in particular for many Ukrainians, immigrating to Australia in the late 1940s and early 1950s enabled them to distance themselves from the rubble of the European Second World War, and their immigration enabled them to be as far as possible from the wars of Europe. On the other hand, Australia's interest was to assimilate the immigrants as quickly as possible. However, Arthur A. Corwell's deep knowledge, understanding and love of history enabled him to become a visionary, with the sense that human life mattered and has meaning, as his daughter Mary Elizabeth stressed recently. In 1948, the first Ukrainians arrived in Australia from these German camps, completed their 2-year contracts and began the influx of human capital into the area of Geelong and surrounds. The other group from Trieste arrived at the beginning of 1954, stayed in Bonegilla, Victoria for a short time, and some of them were not required to complete their 2-year contract. But within a short time they found themselves in Geelong. They informed each other that work was in plentiful supply. Uniqueness. The uniqueness of the Ukrainian community in Geelong is the two twigs of immigration. One twig comes from Ukraine via Germany, having departed Ukraine during the Second World War. The other twig of Ukrainians was from Bosnia-Herzegovina, the former Yugoslavia, whose ancestors departed Ukraine at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. These two twigs joined forces and became a hub, a cultural centre. In 2018, this cultural centre will celebrate 70 years of continuous development and preservation of Ukrainian cultural identity and heritage. Ukrainians are part of the changing face of Australian society, although the new Australians were encouraged to blend into the environment as quickly as possible for the sake of social cohesion. Ukrainians became a cohesive and yet diverse interactive group that partook in the expansion of Geelong. This is Dr. Natalie Senjov-Makohon thanking you for listening to the second podcast of 3 podcasts about the two twigs of immigration to Geelong, Australia. Please join me for the third and last podcast. I will outline Geelong's economic situation and the contribution our Ukrainian Geelong immigrants made in the 1950s and 1960s.